Distance to participate in the conference today. One is Cheryl Zielinski, who hails from Chicago. She is the director of the ABA Center for Bono. So Cheryl, thank you. Thank you. And Deanna Nelson, who is with the New York Attorney General's office, who spoke to us about very important consumer issues for veterans and service members. Is Deanna still here? Thank you. So check Deanna out. Thank you all. So we, again, are really honored and privileged to host this signature event in the legal services community. For 16 years, we've been working with you to put on such a collaborative endeavor. We work with the legal services community, the private bar, the bench, other human service agencies, anyone interested in ensuring equal access to justice in Maryland. I want to thank all of you for being part of it and for showing your support. Before we go any further, of course, I do need to recognize some of our major supporters and long-standing partners, namely the Maryland Legal Services Corporation, the Maryland State Bar Association, the Administrative Office of the Courts, and the Department of Housing and Community Development. We're also grateful to our corporate sponsors listed in your programs, including our benefactors, DLA Piper and the Venable Foundation, our partners, Tides and Rosenberg and Whiteford Taylor and Preston, and our advocates, Haley Rothman, Seifert and Shaw, Wright Constable and Skeen, and Carney Callahan Bresner, Bennett and Scher. So thank you to all of those firms. We're really fortunate to work with all of the major components of the legal delivery system and our partners who join us in pursuing access to justice initiatives. Many of them are represented here today, and a few of them you will hear from in just a few minutes. Most of you, I'm sure, are aware of the vital role the Maryland Legal Services Corporation, MLSC, plays in our community. Susan Ehrlichman has been the director for a number of years, and we are thrilled to have her join us today. We could not do what we do without Susan, her tireless effort, what MLSC supports and allows us to do in our work. So please welcome Susan.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I am absolutely delighted to be here today and for Maryland Legal Services Corporation to be one of the sponsors of this conference. It's really a wonderful opportunity to have you come together to support the work that you do and learn from each other. Very briefly, I see in the notes that I'm supposed to provide some MLSC news, and I'm happy to do that. Just about a year ago, actually a year ago to the day of this conference, we were celebrating very significant and important victories in the Maryland General Assembly. As I think all of you know, we have had some very, very significant challenges over the past several years, funding challenges, as has every other community that relies on IOLTA as a major funding source, which is every state and jurisdiction in the country. Back when that bad thing happened, called the Great Recession, we lost 70% of IOLTA income. As nationally, 70% of IOLTA income was lost, and we have yet to regain that. However, because of the efforts of this community, this really incredible community, we rallied, and we were able to, with the help of so many of you in this room and the leadership of the bench and the bar and the governor's office, go to the Maryland General Assembly and fill that IOLTA hole. It was a huge, huge accomplishment, and we have been extremely fortunate. So in 2010, we made up the difference. We were able to restore the funding cuts that we had to make the year before, and last year we were able to get those increases, the filing fee surcharge increases, extended for another 5 years. Would have liked to have gotten them eliminated, but we did get them extended for another 5 years. This is all to say that we are, unlike many of our sister programs, we are really holding steady. Delighted that I'm able to stand here and say that to you. Maryland Legal Services Corporation will be making grant decisions very shortly, within the next few weeks for the coming year. There will be no mandated cuts. We were also able to solicit one-time grants from our providers, so many programs that have been struggling with outdated software, computers, phone systems, were able to come to us for funding for those initiatives this year, and we are really, really delighted that we are in the position to consider those requests. Again, I just, this fight doesn't end. We are holding steady, but that's not where we need to be. It's not where we want to be. We need to keep talking, not only to each other, but certainly to our friends, our families, the public, and educate them, really explain to them what we do, because not surprisingly, I think to many of you, there's been research that confirms that most of the general public doesn't even know what civil legal services is. And it's incumbent upon us to, of course, continue to educate your legislators and public officials about the work that you do on behalf of their constituencies, but also just help educate the public as to the critical work that you do for Marylanders every single day. So I want to, again, thank you for everything you do every day. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Enjoy lunch, and I look forward to the rest of the conference with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Another partner, of course, in our struggle for equal access to justice is the Legal Aid Bureau. Championing the fight, Wilhelm Joseph, as the executive director, and I will ask him to come say a few words because we know that with programs like Legal Aid, we hope that we eventually move people out of the throes of poverty and discrimination.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's an honor and a privilege to be here. I think we want to give a big round of applause to Sharon and the folks who organized this wonderful partnership conference. Great job. I think it makes Maryland very special. I want to thank all the sponsors, participants, attendees, judges, everyone, for making this a very special conference. Susan just talked about the successes we've had in Maryland. I want to share with you an insight and something that you may not know. The Legal Aid Bureau, Maryland Legal Aid, is an organization partially funded by the Federal Legal Services Corporation. There are about 140 Legal Service Corporation funded entities around the country in every state. Several of them rely on the federal budget for up to 95% of their funding. Some 80, some 70. That is the most unstable source of funding for legal services in the country. Congress is doing nothing, and Congress has been cutting and slashing that funding for many years. However, what is notable, Susan told you how we were able to maintain the level of funding and increase from her source in Maryland. Maryland Legal Aid relies the least on the federal funding for its support, the least in the entire country. Only 14% of the budget of $27 million comes from the federal government. And that's a credit to all the partners in Maryland. Many of you in this room, we want to thank you. There's two more things. One, I just want to reiterate why we are here. We are here because there are hundreds of thousands of people in Maryland who have no voice because of their condition of poverty. They have no voice. and those who have a little voice, they cannot be heard. All of us in this room, individually and collectively, we try to give voice for these people. And sometimes we try to let them get meaningful access to a just system and hopefully a just and fair result. That's why we're here. So I urge you to keep doing what you're doing. It's a beautiful state. I have declared on my own, without authority, that Maryland is the #1 human rights state in this country. And if you want to contradict me, go right ahead. But we are. The record speaks for itself. And we are going to do everything we can to strengthen that position, the #1 human rights state in this country. And to be consistent, the Legal Aid Bureau has formally adopted, the Board of Directors formally adopted a human rights framework. And we are looking at our work every day through the lens of, does this issue, is our response consistent with internationally agreed upon basic human rights? It's a big challenge. That's what we're doing. So thank you very much, and enjoy your lunch and a good conference.
Thank you, Wilhelm. The Maryland Access to Justice Commission, as many of you know, has initiated numerous activities over the past few years, some very successful initiatives that have helped increase access to justice across the state and our interface with the public. So I will ask its Executive Director, Pam Ortiz, to speak to us as well.
Thanks. I'm delighted to join you all today, and I relish coming back to this conference year after year, because while many of you have gone through maybe a couple of job changes in the last 16 years, every year I come back and see you because you cannot get away from this work. You're committed to bettering the lives of people more vulnerable than us. So thank you for your hard work. You're all my heroes. The Commission does its work in collaboration with many of you, so I just wanted to share a few of the Commission's most recent activities, many of which you or your organizations have participated in and helped make possible. One of the foci of the Commission is to help the courts support and help you as providers support the self-represented and make it easier for persons who still are unable to get counsel to access the courts and to advance their claims. One of our more recent activities has been to continue to develop a series of short format videos on a range of self-help topics. If you haven't seen them, you can find them on the court's website, mdcourts.gov, and we've released 6 so far. Should I represent myself? Finding legal help, finding and working with your lawyer, a tips video, service of process, and defending a small claim. We've got about 8 more in production. We're doing in collaboration with the court's media department and Office of Communications. We'll have some forthcoming on such highlighted topics as expungements, both criminal and eventually juvenile with the new statute. Some really complicated areas for folks. I've probably been up here several times talking about pending rule initiatives, and this year I'm able to say that the Commission's 3 primary rules initiatives have finally passed the Rules Committee, and you can look forward to seeing them in a forthcoming report before they're fully determined and hopefully adopted by the Court of Appeals. Those include rule changes that will promote limited scope representation, which holds, I think, real promise for moderate and low-income Marylanders. Rule initiatives to improve the practice in granting and applying for and granting fee waivers in court cases, including provisions that will make it easier for legal services providers to secure automatic fee waivers for their clients and civil clients of the Office of the Public Defender as well. And finally, a rule that we worked on closely with PBRC and others to promote pro bono, to allow out-of-state lawyers barred out of state but living here, to practice pro bono, without having to become active members of the Maryland Bar. So all three of those were endorsed by the Rules Committee, and we should see them in a forthcoming report. For those of you who follow the rulemaking process, I would encourage you to comment on them and support their adoption. We have a few other initiatives pending. As many of you know, in 2013, the General Assembly passed a bill creating a task force to study implementing a civil right to counsel in Maryland. Our commission is staffing that, and quite a few folks are participating in that process, including 6 legislators, and that group will be deliberating over the summer and wrapping up its work by October. We've got quite a few other initiatives that are ongoing, but I do want to mention that in the next year the Commission will be undertaking a strategic planning initiative, and I hope that there will be opportunities for us to hear from many stakeholders about what vision you all have for access to justice and the work that we can do together to make that a reality in Maryland. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. As noted earlier this morning, the MSBA Section Council of Delivery of Legal Services is a co-sponsor of this conference. I want to ask its current chair, Bonnie Sullivan, to come up and speak to you about the important work that they do. Thank you. It's tough getting out.
I just don't want to fall. Excuse me. I'm just going to take a moment. I'm the current chair of the Delivery of Legal Services Section Council, which many of you should know about. If not in your materials, we would love to have you join the section and the Section Council. We have vacancies now. This is a section of the State Bar, as Sharon mentioned, that does not require dues payment to the section. So there's an added incentive to join. We've been very active in a variety of projects over the last few years, certainly supporting the filing fee surcharge and the various funding bills that have been before the General Assembly. We've also worked closely with the Board of Governors of the State Bar to promote those important legislative endeavors. A few years ago, the section published a guardianship handbook. This year, with the leadership of PBRC and HELP, a guide to legal service providers in the state and resources for the public that's also on the People's Law Library now in electronic form. So we're a busy, active section, and I just want you to take a look at this handout. There is no charge to join except membership in the State Bar. That is required. But other than that, which most of you I'm sure are, please join us and help promote access to legal services in Maryland.
Thanks, Bonnie. I also am incredibly privileged to work with a wonderful board of directors. They're committed, compassionate, bright, energetic people, and I just would like all our board members to stand and be recognized right now. Thank them. James? Yeah. Go ahead. Thank you. One other important group, and I know that Judge Jensen gave a shout out to them earlier this morning, but the judiciary. The judiciary has been on the forefront and really helped support pro bono legal services throughout. I just want to thank all the members of the bench again who came out and participated in panels, helped on the planning committee, and are here supporting our work. So I was going to ask the same question that Wilhelm did, which was, why are we here today? My 14-year-old daughter came home from school the other day, and she was very distraught. There were 2 kids in her class who had been bullied, and she spent her time consoling one and standing up for the other one. I was very proud of her, but I heard her later calling one of her friends and saying, I don't understand why you didn't say anything. Why didn't you stand up for yourself? Why didn't you fight back? And you know, she had further conversations, and I had to explain to her, you know, they didn't have the capacity, the courage to do that, but what you did was the right thing, standing up. The next day, I took her to the rally in Baltimore City that was sponsored by Mayor Rawlings Blake, the Bring Back Our Girls rally. And she and some of her classmates were there listening to the organizer, who was actually a Holocaust survivor, the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor. And she was saying to the crowd, we cannot stand idly by and let these things happen. We can't let an atrocity occur and let it go, have it go unanswered. So the confluence of these two events gave me reason to just pause. I'm not naive enough, I guess, to believe that either incident will really make a huge difference or change the world, but it does send a message, and it's a first step. It's a start, and we have to teach our children the important message that you do need to take a stand, that apathy has no place, that indifference has no standing, and inaction has no excuse. Hate in all its ugly guises can only be extinguished by reason and overcome by education. Injustice can only be thwarted by equal access to a principled, accessible, and equitable judicial system. We have no choice but to raise our voices, as we've heard earlier. We have to respond to the call. We have to be guided by our moral compass. If we do not, we will watch, again, as hatred breeds more hatred and discrimination and violence become the social norm. Each person in this room is raising his or her voice. You are all shouting on behalf of the victimized. You're empowering people to stand up, to have them pursue their rights, to have them follow their principles. I am truly in awe of everything that you all do every day. It's not easy to continue to fight the unscrupulous landlords and creditors, to correct bureaucratic mistakes, to referee family disputes, and demand fair treatment for the homeless, the disabled, the incarcerated, or the abused. It's not easy to work for years and years on law reform and systemic change. Your work is at once challenging, demanding, rewarding, and exhausting. But you need to stay with it, and as one homeowner told me, fight the fight. You need to continue to raise your voice, monitor the system, and assert the rights of those who can't do it for themselves. To say that you represent and ensure the future of our democracy is not hyperbole. You are the symbol of and the hope for our humanity. So I just want to thank you all. Given the incidents of late, it is particularly apropos that we have the privilege of hearing our keynote speaker today. I'm going to ask an unrelenting advocate for equal justice and human rights, Judge Kathy Surratt of the Prince George's County Circuit Court, to do the honor of introducing her. Judge Surratt, as many of you know, is currently an active member of the Standing Committee on Pro Bono Legal Service, the Access to Justice Commission, a former PBRC board member, and too many other committees to mention. Judge Surratt.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. When the committee got together for our conference, Stephanie Joseph and I were tasked with finding an extraordinary keynote speaker for the lunch. I'm thrilled to tell you that we have an extraordinary keynote speaker for the lunch. Martina Vandenberg, who will address you, is a brilliant, passionate human rights champion. She spent nearly 2 decades fighting human trafficking, forced labor, rape as a war crime, violence against women, and has represented human trafficking victims in a pro bono manner in immigration, civil, and criminal cases. Her resume is long and is written in your materials. I just want to touch on some of them and add a couple things that aren't in there because it is quite impressive and important. It's actually, I'm thrilled that she's sitting right here next to Wilhelm today, 2 of our major human rights advocates here in the state. Martina has testified before the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Human Rights and the Law, the Helsinki Commission, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and the House Armed Service Committees. She was formerly employed by Human Rights Watch as a researcher and spearheaded investigations into human rights violations in the Russian Federation, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Uzbekistan, Kosovo, Israel, and Ukraine. She authored the first published report documenting human trafficking in Israel and is the author of 2 Human Rights Watch reports, Hopes Betrayed, Trafficking of Women and Girls to Post-Conflict Bosnia and Herzegovina, thank you, Forced Prostitution, and Kosovo, Rape as a Weapon of Ethnic Cleansing. While living in the Russian Federation, she co-founded Sayostri, one of Russia's first rape centers for women. Martina documented rape as a war crime in Kosovo and helped to influence the prosecutors there to amend the indictment against Milosevic to add rape as a crime against humanity. In 2012, she founded the Human Trafficking Pro Bono Legal Center, where she joins trafficked victims and lawyers to represent victims around the country. Friends and colleagues, I am so proud to have here at our conference, Martina.
Thank you so much, Judge Surratt. I'm a huge fan of Judge Surratt. We meet at all of the National Association of Women Judges conferences, and so it's delightful to be here, an honor to be here. It's also an honor to sit next to Wilhelm, who also asked me one favor, which is for all of the legal aid attorneys to stand up, please. I know you're here. Are there legal aid attorneys in the room? Please stand up and be recognized. So you are living the dream, and recently I have joined you in living the dream, and the dream is all pro bono all the time, right? So I was a partner in a law firm, and I got to do all pro bono some of the time, but then I left the law firm because I wanted to do all pro bono all the time, and so I salute you for sort of following that and doing all pro bono all the time. I think because it is May, and because we are on the cusp of a couple of big events, one of them being report cards, and one of them being the release of the State Department's Trafficking in Persons report in June, I thought that the most appropriate thing to talk to you about today is report cards. Right? You're waiting for your children to get theirs. You're waiting to find out which college your children are getting into. My son's waiting for his 6th grade report card. And the U.S. government is about to rate itself for how it's doing on the trafficking agenda. I spent 4 years in the Russian Federation. My favorite Russian word is konkretna, which means concrete. I am not a theoretician, I'm a numbers person. So I'd like to give this report card and start first with what is going wrong. What are we doing badly in the United States? Because I have to say, having worked on trafficking for 2 decades, we are not making an enormous amount of headway. So the first area where we are really falling down on the job is the discrepancy between state and federal law. Many of you may know that under federal law, a child who is trafficked, anyone under 18 years old who is induced to commit a commercial sex act, no fraud, no force, no coercion, just under 18 and coerced to commit a commercial sex act, that child is trafficked under federal law. But guess what? In most states around the United States, that child is prosecuted. That child is convicted. That child is a criminal. And so we have this enormous discrepancy between federal law, which calls these victims, and state law, which calls them perpetrators and criminals. We're falling down on the job. The other thing that we see are state laws around the country that are passed, an excellent innovation, except many of the state laws that we see around the country deal only with one piece of trafficking. They deal only with trafficking into the sex industry and do not deal with trafficking into forced labor. We're falling down on the ground because we have so few prosecutions. You could read the New York Times and you could be tricked into believing that all the Department of Justice is doing these days is prosecuting trafficking cases, and it is not so. Because if you actually look at the government numbers, the numbers published by the U.S. Attorney General himself, in 2012, we had 128 federal criminal trafficking prosecutions in the entire United States. In 2011, we had 125. There's another discrepancy because we see much more prosecution of forced prostitution and child sexual commercial exploitation. So 101 of those cases were sex cases and only 24 were forced labor cases. If you talk to the NGOs that work on trafficking around the world, they will say, even here in the United States, that the vast majority of their caseload is forced labor cases, and yet those are not the cases that are prosecuted. We are falling down because we have little protection for victims. Very little protection for victims. One of the things that the federal government does is create a sort of immigration regime. It's called continued presence. And if you get continued presence, you can cooperate as a witness in a federal case. Last year, the federal government bragged that they had opened 1,000 trafficking cases, investigations. That's all good. But they gave this protection to only 171 people in the United States. How is it that we can ask trafficking victims who are so terrified to help us prosecute the traffickers if we do not protect them? And some of the traffickers may surprise you. If you follow the prosecutions here done by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Baltimore, you will know that one of the trafficking prosecutions here, trafficking of a minor into the sex industry, was done by a firefighter, now a former firefighter. There was another case prosecuted involving a former police officer. We are falling down on the ground because one of the things that we see in the federal law is that trafficking victims are guaranteed restitution. Under Maryland law, there's restitution too. Mandatory restitution in the federal law. Mandatory means to me 100%. Wilmer Hale, a wonderful pro bono law firm, just completed a huge research project, and they delivered to our center binders, not binders of women like Mitt Romney got, but actual huge binders, and huge binders of trafficking cases, 306 in all. So we got the binders of trafficking cases, and then we analyzed all of those binders of trafficking cases to find out how many cases ended up with restitution in cases of conviction and plea deals. Not 100%. 36%. How is that mandatory? How are we actually taking care of victims? In the period that we analyzed, 2009 to 2012, eliminating all the cases where we had acquittals, where all the cases, everything was, something was still open, the case was not closed. In that entire period, the total amount of restitution given to trafficking victims was approximately $11 million. $11 million is a drop in the bucket, and particularly when you consider the fact that one restitution order in one case with Judge Sullivan in the District of Columbia, where Judge Sullivan decided that there needed to be a lawyer for the victims, and the victims in this case were 4 little girls who had been runaways, who had been picked up at bus stops in 2 cases, little girls picked up at bus stops at the age of 11 or 12, taken by a man named Shelby Lewis, taken to his home. He was awarded legal custody for at least one of these children the day I raped that child. He put all of those children into prostitution, and luckily Judge Sullivan realized that those children needed a lawyer. He appointed a guardian ad litem. That guardian ad litem calculated the restitution amount, which is what the trafficker earned. That's the federal remedy, what the trafficker earned. Those children testified that they had quotas of $500 a night. And so the court, the guardian ad litem, the prosecutor got together, they multiplied $500 a night by the number of days those children were held, in one case 171 days, and that was the restitution order. That was the measure, along with the number of statutory damages. The restitution order in that case, $3.8 million against Mr. Lewis. That shows us how minuscule $11 million is. If nearly $4 million is eaten up by one case where the judge took the initiative. So before I leave you completely depressed over your coffee, let me turn to the positive side of the ledger, because it's not all bad news. So what is going right? Well, one thing that's going right is that we have some visionaries and brainiacs who have entered the trafficking field, and one of them is here in this room, Jessica Emerson. a number of really wonderful young lawyers who are on the absolute cutting edge of anti-trafficking work. And what is that cutting edge? That cutting edge is vacatur and expungement. It started in New York. It's now happening in Maryland. When a trafficking victim has a conviction for prostitution, a conviction for dealing drugs, a prosecution, a conviction for whatever the crime may be that her trafficker or his trafficker forced them to commit, that person's life is ruined. You cannot get a job. You cannot rent a house. You cannot get a student loan. You cannot, as one child found out in New York, you cannot become the foster parent for another sibling. So a child who was trafficked into the sex industry was convicted of carrying a pocket knife. She carried that pocket knife because she wanted to be able to defend herself against bad clients because she was forced into prostitution by a trafficker. When she became older, she wanted to take custody as a foster care provider for a younger sibling. And guess what? Because she had a conviction on her record for carrying a weapon, she could not be a foster care provider. So the brilliant lawyers at the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center in New York took that case on, and against and over the protests of the prosecution, over the protests of the district attorney, they managed to convince a judge in that borough in New York to vacate that conviction, get it off the record, because that child did not commit that crime voluntarily. It was related to the trafficking. And so she was able to actually become a foster parent. Vacating convictions is the absolute cutting edge of this area of work. And the pro bono attorneys, DLA Piper is here and others, the pro bono attorneys who are supporting that effort are to be congratulated, and because it's heroic work that requires major creativity. One of the law firms doing this work is Weil, and they have now gone into court and argued ineffective assistance of counsel, where children were told to plead guilty to crimes that they could not possibly have committed under federal standards. So what's the other good news? The news on restitution, frankly, is not all bad, because there are some brilliant lawyers in Maine Justice at the Department of Justice. One of them is Cindy Chung, who just did a case here in Maryland, who are being creative when it comes to restitution. And so in a case that was just prosecuted here in the Greenbelt court, a woman who was allegedly held for 10 years in forced labor in domestic servitude in a home in a nice upper middle class neighborhood. A home that from the outside you would think was the site of all wholesomeness and good, and yet inside that household there were allegations of forced labor. The prosecution in that case allowed the defendants to plead out to alien harboring, which from my perspective as a victim's right attorney is a little bit of nothing, right? So they pled out to alien harboring. But then the Department of Justice had a 2-day hearing on restitution. And at the end of that 2-day hearing, Judge Chasnow decided that not only would there be restitution for back wages of 10 years of uncompensated labor, but in addition, she would also award liquidated damages under the Fair Labor Standards Act. The restitution order in that case was close to $360,000. The news is not all bad. The news is also not all bad because Congress gave us the keys to the courthouse. So in 2003, they provided a civil remedy for trafficking victims. Write this down, 18 U.S.C. 1595. A civil remedy for trafficking victims so that if the feds drop the case, or if the feds don't bring a case at all, trafficking victims can go to federal court and sue the traffickers themselves. And so since that law passed, there have been 123 actions with trafficking victims who have stood up for themselves and said, I am going to obtain justice. And they have done that with the assistance of pro bono attorneys like you in this room. Other good news, the U.S. government published a little pamphlet. It seems like a little bit of nothing. This little pamphlet, which is handed out to every single person coming to the United States to get a work visa, has the phone number of the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline. This little pamphlet, translated into only about 11 or 12 languages, has generated thousands and thousands of calls to the human trafficking hotline. This little pamphlet underscores one of the things that I think is a myth of trafficking. I think there's an assumption that sort of trafficking victims are all foreign born and they all sneak across the border. Every single trafficking survivor I have represented in the United States arrived in the United States with a legal visa, a contract, and the expectation of a legal job. When they got here, it all went wrong through no fault of their own. So there is good news. The Human Trafficking Hotline is getting calls. But the real good news, the fundamental good news, is all of you. Because pro bono attorneys are now making an enormous difference in the human trafficking world. Hillary Axsom, who's the head of the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit at the Department of Justice, at Maine Justice, recently spoke on a Pro Bono Institute CLE call. And she gave out an impassioned plea for pro bono attorneys to represent trafficking victims in criminal cases. Again, it's unusual, I think, for prosecutors to want victims' rights attorneys to enter the fray, and yet Maine Justice is saying that pro bono attorneys are welcome and our prosecutors will work with you. One of my favorite stories, and I'll leave you with this, is the story of a woman who walked into a big law firm with a lobby, a beautiful lobby like the ones where many of you work, with marble and palm trees and an atrium and statues. And she walked into this beautiful law firm and she turned to her social worker and she said to her social worker, "Are these my lawyers?" And the social worker said, "Yes, and they're going to work for you for free. They're going to work for you pro bono." And she said, "You know, I feel like the powerful people are on my side now." And that's why we do this. Because it's about time. Because the powerful people should be on the side of the trafficking survivors in the United States. Thank you.
That's not good if you know I do. It involves that. Yes.